All right, we're live now. Um,
Nice.
all right, so today we're going to be responding to um, Christian Idealism. Um, he responded to me on an off-the-cuff stream I did a little while ago on the problem of evil. This was a month ago, um, and I'll be responding with a guest this time. Naturalism next. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Naturalism Next is the name of sort of my blog and my YouTube channel, and I only have one video out on my YouTube channel right now, but I've been in the online philosophy of religion space for a while. But if you're interested in what I do, you can follow me on Twitter or on my YouTube channel. Generally speaking, I'm interested in the philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind. I'm a recent college student doing neuroscience now, but I have a lot of interest in the problem of evil. Did a lot of writing on it during my undergrad. So I was interested in joining up with how do you want truth teller? Is that how
Yeah,
you want to be
truth
referred to?
teller.
Truth teller.
Truth
Truth
teller
teller.
is my Reddit account. Truth
Gotcha.
teller is my YouTube account.
Yeah. So we're just gonna jointly respond, and just to put it out there, I haven't like pre-vetted the stream, so it's a very off the cuff sort of response we're doing. But
Yeah, I'm
that's
a
it.
bit more prepared because I have a PowerPoint and I have watched the whole thing before. But I figured I should get this guy on because he's more familiar with the problem of evil than me, I think. Anyways, what do you say we start?
Yeah, We'll start. Are we gonna watch this on like 2 times speed, or are we just gonna watch
Yeah,
it
we're
pretty
gonna
good
watch
at
it.
speed?
Like, no way we're gonna watch a 2 hour video.
Okay,
Let's do
sounds
that.
good. Sounds good. All right.
All right, let's get it started.
because I left it at my old house. So today's stream, I'm not going to be showing my face.
Is the
We'll
volume
do a
good, by
response
the
video,
way?
and that response
Volume's
video
good,
is
yeah.
going to be. I actually just found this like a few days ago, so keep in mind that I didn't even know about this response video until recently. So let's see here. Yep, there it is. So now as you could probably all see, this is an hour and a half long, over an hour and a half long video response to what I had to say on Zach's channel. And so I don't know if I'm going to necessarily go over everything, but I will try to go over as much as I can, and I will try to give a response to each point that he tried to do. So I don't know how long the stream's going to be. It's probably going to be, I would say, a few hours. So just because I'm going to try to respond to as much as I can, but we'll see how it goes. Anyways, with that in mind, let me make sure my thing is working, because last time I had this problem, last time I tried to do a stream, it actually crashed. So hopefully it doesn't happen again. But yeah, whatever. Anyways, let's get started then with the video.
All right, and we are, and obviously like the oldest known version goes back to Epicurus, but there's a lot more modern versions. Obviously, there's basically that there's
I'm going to try to get to
for him to get to his points. So he probably not exactly familiar.
Yeah, we can just skip forward when he starts talking.
Oh, so that's why. Sorry, this is like one of my first times watching this, so I apologize if I have to.
He's doing the same thing. What God have to do when we're creating the transition world into state of okay, now yeah, this is when I start getting into my logical part. Like it's not really mine because it comes. I got it from a few papers, one by Richard R. Lacroix and another by J.L. Schellenberg. It's like it has to do with whether God would create it all, since he'd have to transition the world from a state where God exists alone to a state where there are some evils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm familiar with like that kind of argument.
Yeah.
All right, so I think the problem with at least that, I mean, I haven't read the argument, so I can't really comment too much on that specific argument, but it already sounds like you're gonna run into problems of incrementability, right? So the moment that you start talking about the best kind of, because I mean, I've addressed this in my video already, but basically there is a distinction between the greatest possible being versus the greatest possible world, or at least kind of world. And I don't even think there is a best. I don't even think there is a best, like, when we're talking about best world, I don't think like I think when we talk about best world, I think we should talk about best kind of world, not necessarily best, like, I think the type token distinction is important here. But it sounds to me, at least given what he said in the argument, you're going to run into problems of incrementability as soon as you try to make that sort of case. At least that sort of logical argument, based on what it reads. So again, the reason why I mention this is just because like there's a reason why I hold to the position I do. There's a reason why I think that probably doesn't work, right? And this is, of course, Mark can say on this, which I will, but at least logical versions probably will just don't even get off the ground because they assume that value is like can be sort of measured in this objective sense, and I don't think that is the case given the problem of incrementability. And so we have to be more careful, at least when we're going to make these sort of strong claims that like, oh, evil is incompatible with theism. Like I think that's I just don't think that can be defended at all, given that. But anyways, let's continue.
All right. Do you have anything to say on that before I get to my slides?
I mean, just from the bat, when he says the problem of incrementability, it seems like, is he talking about the idea that we can't really identify any best possible world? Is that what he's getting at?
Yeah, I think he's appealing to from Trent Doherty's, and I actually Tim Howard introduced me to this. It's a specific sort of theodicy. It's called the quasi-Leibnizian theodicy, where there is no best possible world. There is only a set of best possible kinds of world, and
I see.
best possible kinds of world would include embodied moral agents, and each of these worlds is incommensurable with each other in terms of value. That's what I understand it to be.
Interesting. I mean, I don't see how that actually has anything to do with the kind of logical problem of evil you were talking about that just says that God would never move the state of the world from the version of the world that has just God to a version of the world that doesn't have God. I mean, you could just stay neutral on whether the version of the world that just has God needs to be classified as the best possible world in some quantitative sense. And it seems like you could still run the argument. That'd be my initial thought. But maybe you have something more to say about that.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. So, this is my slideshow here. Yeah, so when I'm talking about the argument from imperfection, so prima facie, what the argument from imperfection is getting at is that God is so I'm just going to read from my slide here, is that God is the greatest possible good, so the greatest possible good obtains without creation, so sans creation. So for God to actualize the world, he would have to transition the world from a state of perfection to a state that contains perfections plus some imperfections, indeed some horrendous evils. And it seems since the world where God exists sans creation, the world where God exists alone, is already perfect, there's no need to permit any evil. So any evil that God permits by choosing to create would be, the idea would be that it would be gratuitous. And this seems incompatible with moral perfection. And so I listed an objection here, which is, I think this is basically what Kyle's getting at, where he says, not so fast. A world where God exists sans creation might entail the exemplification of all great-making qualities qua being, but this does not entail that all great-making qualities qua world are exemplified, in which case it would be good for God to create a world which instantiates, such great-making qualities, so the great-making qualities qua world. That's what I understand his objection to be. He's like distinguishing,
Gotcha.
worlds and being.
Right.
And my reply is, it gets a little bit more complicated. I have like more slides on this, but like the prima facie case that I laid out beforehand isn't even the end of the story. The argument I was making is something that turns on the following premise, and it's going to take some explicating to like understand what the premise is saying. So the premise is an omnipotent, omniscient person is morally perfect only if he eliminates any evil, which is such that for any good that entails it, there is a greater good which does not entail it. So, I know like a lot of people's immediate reaction is going to be to that. Like, what does that even mean? Like, what is this? But we'll get to that. And also, I have a formulation here if anyone's interested in reading it. So, why believe that premise? And also, I have like in case we're confused. We have, I don't know why I thought that this would eliminate confusion, but I have like a first order logic.
A formal statement of it, yeah.
So, basically what the argument is, what the premise is saying is that there existing a maximally great being entails that for all x, if x is evil, it entails that for all y, if y it has the property of being a greater good which outweighs the evil. And hold on, let me read this again. So there exists an x such that x is a maximally great being, entails that for all x, if x is evil, x being evil entails that there exists a y such that y is a greater good that outweighs the evil, and y entails x, and there exists a z. Oh my God! Why did I think that it was a good idea to do this? I'm just gonna ignore that now. All right, so
I'm sure the people who understand formal logic will follow it, and the other people, they can read the text.
Yeah. I don't even know if it's like a proper formulation. I don't even know why I added that, but whatever. So the crucial premise is premise 5, which is the premise I've discussed earlier. So why think an omnipotent, omniscient person is morally perfect only if he eliminates any instance of evil, which is such that for any good that entails it, right? So any good that entails the evil, and I'm going to assume, I'm not going to explain everything. I'm not going to like baby the audience here. I'm going to assume that they understand what entailment relations are. There is a greater good which does not entail it. So why accept it? Well, to see why, the premise on reflection has intuitive possibility. We must examine its content. An omnipotent person, by definition, can actualize at any time t any logically possible state of affairs at t. An omniscient person, by definition, knows all true propositions. So there's no limitation on the actions of an omnipotent omniscient being aside from logical possibility. What about moral perfection? It seems a morally perfect person is a person that responds ideally to moral reasons. That is, they always will do the best action given the circumstances and their powers. But an O2, so O2 is an omnipotent omniscient person, is not limited in their powers nor by contingent circumstances. It follows that if such a person is morally perfect, they will do what is all things considered best, tout court. Tout court means, just all things considered. So, for what reason would an O2 morally perfect person permit evil? According to the hypothesis proposed, so I put it in Latin words, ex hypothesi, but they would do so only if the permission of the evil is in all things considered good, and there was no better option available among the range of logically possible options that could have been actualized. But why is it not enough to say that an O2 morally perfect person would allow the evil? And this is what many theists say. Why is it not enough to say that a morally perfect person would allow the evil if there's a greater good which logically entails the evil? Why must it be that for any greater good which entails the evil in question, that it's not the case that there is a greater good which does not entail the evil? Why does that have to be the case? Why can't it just be that that there's a greater good which entails the evil? And I'm going to explain why in this next slide. I know there's like many slides to dedicate to this one argument, but so why believe premise 5 continued? Let E be a lesser evil and let G be a greater good, such that the good-making features of G massively outweighs the bad-making features of E. We can construct a conjunctive property, and a conjunctive property would be such and such and such and such. That's what conjunction is. So E and G. So E and G would be some evil. And based on how we've defined it, this conjunctive property is a greater good. So because E is a lesser evil and G is a greater good which outweighs it. Now, the conjunctive property E and G entails E because E is part of E and G's content. So this is trivial since E is one of the conjuncts, obviously. So E is entailed by a greater good. Does it follow that E would be permitted by a morally perfect agent? Clearly not. You can construct any arbitrary conjunction of any particular evil and a greater good or set of greater goods, and you can get that the evil in question is entailed by a greater good, namely the conjunction, E and G. It would be absurd to say that all evils are justified in that basis. Nonetheless, we can even suppose that E and G is not an arbitrary conjunction. It still doesn't follow that E would be permitted by a morally perfect agent, because it still might be the case that the greater good of G alone could have been actualized rather than the conjunctive property E and G, in which case a morally perfect agent, if they had the power to do so, would have actualized the greater good G instead of the greater good E and G. So in light of this reflection, premise 5 looks plausible. An O2 person is morally perfect only if he eliminates any evil, which is such that for any greater good that entails the evil, there's a greater good which does not entail the evil. So that's my justification for the premise, and this is sort of my own version of the problem of evil that I got, it's inspired by works I've read from J.L. Schellenberg and Richard Lecoq. I kind of combined them a bit and created my own version, and this is the formulation here, which you can see. Do you have any immediate thoughts on this?
So is this meant to be a response to or a reformulation of the logical problem of evil that you originally presented? Like, what logical problem of evil do you present in the video that he's responding to?
Yeah,
or is this?
It's kind of like an expansion on that. I didn't really
Gotcha.
I didn't really do. I obviously didn't do the whole thing about the conjunctive property or even say anything about that premise. I just sort of said, well, look, God is perfect, so why would he transition the world from a state of perfection to a state with some evils? But I think a more sophisticated version of the argument would be one which has a premise like the one I said, which is an omnipotent omniscient person is morally perfect only if it eliminates any evil, which is such that for any greater good that entails that there is a greater good which does not entail it. And with that premise, as you can see with this argument, we can actually derive the conclusion that God does not exist. And obviously there's going to be ways to worm out of this. For any deductive argument, there's going to be ways to get out of it. I'm not claiming that this is decisive, this refutes theism completely, and I've just destroyed theism. But by my lights, as far as deductive arguments go in the context of philosophy of religion, this seems relatively plausible to me. Do you have any thoughts on it, or should I just move on?
No, let's just keep going, I think.
All right.
I think that's a much more stronger perspective probably than J.L. Mackie and his logical probability. Basically, that's the version of probability that's the first.
you're always wanting to use it to temporary and philosophy of religion, and it doesn't work out so well because basically there's difficulty of trying to get theists to accept claims that are committed of theism, which went into contradiction, and Mack doesn't succeed in doing that as I think it shows, I don't think Mack history works that good, but I think he successfully shows that Mackey fails to write a contradiction.
Well, that's good to know. So at least he agrees with Mackey's argument. At least that part of Mackey's argument doesn't work. So.
But I think that Richard Arlow's attempt to write contradiction from appeasing the philosophy of theism, I think that his attempt is way better in his paper is called Unjustified Evil, Not Choice. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about that. So yeah, basically, what he's talking about is that evil is easily admitted. His first approach was that he admits evil is not violence against theism, but it's not enough to show that theism is positively irrational, given all the evidence taken into consideration. Right? And I think that's probably one of the best approaches to problem evil.
I'm gonna skip this because I'm trying to see where he starts to make objections.
There's an interesting strategy he did when combining his approach with Tooley approach. I think this is where I start talking about Tooley's problem of evil.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not a skeptical theist, but I mean, I'll let him speak for this. Alright, I'm gonna see because he doesn't really seem to be responding to what I have to say.
Wait,
So I'm just gonna go to the parts where he actually does respond to what I have to say because I don't want to spend too much time. At least I don't want to spend too much unnecessary time on these points. So let me get to where he starts making his real arguments.
Okay, so I guess he skips over the part where I don't really remember this, but basically the Michael Tooley argument argues that it's kind of similar. Well, not really. It's not really similar to the Draperian route. It's more like a direct inductive route, which argues from an equiprobability principle, which would be something like similar to the principle of indifference, where if you have a set of like jointly exhaustive, mutually exclusive properties, and you have no reason to assign one property rather than another property, like so, for instance, we have the property of there being some unknown right-making factor which outweighs all the known wrong-making factors, or you can have the property of there being an unknown wrong-making factor which outweighs all the known right-making factors. And the idea is, if you use this equiprobability principle, there's going to be you can map out 4 possibilities, and using the equiprobability principle, you wouldn't have any reason to assign one possibility a higher probability than the other, so you'd have like a 1 in 4 chance that the evil is all things considered justified. And then when you look at like a whole set of evils, like when you look at out in the world and see that there's like thousands or millions of instances of horrific suffering, then given that in conjunction with this equiprobability principle, it's going to look really bad for theism. Like it's going to look like at least one evil is going to be all things considered unjustified for God to commit. That's kind of like the basic idea. Do you have anything further to say on that?
No, I think that, well, does he get into objecting to that, or?
I thought he did, but it's weird because he doesn't seem to be responding to it. I think he's just skipping over it. But
no, I think Tooley's formulation is interesting. I know it relies on a few like probability assumptions that I really am not equipped to evaluate the strength of, but it gets at the general points. I think it gets at a general point that undermines skeptical theism, but we shouldn't get too far into it if he doesn't even address it.
Yeah, right. Okay. Bad is sort of an term, whereas if you actually think what God would do, we might use being a possible term, right?
No. So that's false. So when we talk about what God would do, we need to use axiological terms. He mentions deontological terms, but that is a subset of axiology. So deontology, virtue ethics, pretty much all of normative ethics is a subset of axiology, right? Because that's the moral domain, right? In fact, I would say that the axiological, if we're going to talk about the axiological domain for a second, I actually do think that encompasses the moral domain, the aesthetic domain, and of course the elethic domain. So there's actually 3 different domains that the axiological landscape covers, right? Now, deontology is a subset of axiology, but like that's pretty much common knowledge, right? So I think he's making a category error here. I think this is the first problem with his responses. He actually doesn't understand when I'm talking about axiology that literally covers everything, right? So when we're talking about good or
Well, see this, like, I think he might be like implicitly assuming some sort of like consequentialism here, because if you're
Yeah, I
just
was thinking of the same thing.
if you like equate like axiology with deontology, like that's going to be like missing like a lot of, like, for example, you might think something like the doctrine of double effect is true, in which case, even if well, here's a standard example, even if you think the fat man pushing pushing the fat man to stop the trolley is, in terms of like axiology, uncontroversially, is going to be, all things considered, in terms of like the relevant goods involved, better than the state of affairs where the trolley hits the 5 people, right? You might think that killing the fat man is like murder, and that that increases the disvalue, but like surely something being murder doesn't like make the fat man's life 5 times more axiologically valuable than 5 people's life. That doesn't seem very plausible. So, well, it might be the case that, like, in terms of like when you just look at the relevant goods and values from a third person perspective, you might think in terms of axiology, like, it's better, but like you might think something like the doctrine of double effect, like directly intending to kill someone or use someone as a means to an end, is impermissible, like no matter what. Like it's just wrong to do, just given the kind of virtues you'd be promoting, or vices you'd be promoting rather, or there being some deontological constraint you'd be violating. What do you think? Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I think that seems like you're not going to be able to reduce everything to, I mean, trying to reduce everything to determinations of value, all things considered, is not going to work on like rights-based views, like deontology. So.
Right, and if there's going to be certain like deontological constraints, then you can't really use axiology alone to predict what God would do, right? Because if something is axiologically better, but it would be wrong to permit, well, since God is morally perfect, God wouldn't do it, right? He can't do anything wrong.
Right. I guess the question is like, does axiology capture things like duties that God might have? But it seems like you're not going to be able to like add up everything and then calculate like the total value of it if you think that there's like separate duties that are irreducible.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the issue is, in the original video, he was just saying, well, if we just answer why does God allow bad states of affairs, then you've just destroyed the problem of evil, or you've answered the problem of evil. Whereas in the relevant sense of the dialectic, I was challenging that because, well, I mean, you can answer why God allows bad like states of affairs in terms of like but there's still be like separate there's a separate question of whether the state of affairs was wrong to permit and whether the state of affairs was bad to permit, right? And
right.
It could be that the state of affairs is bad to permit in terms of like it entails some set of like some disvalue, but if it's all things considered wrong to permit, then that like avoids this entire issue of like it being consistent with there being bad states of affairs with theism, right? Like, because if it's all things considered wrong to permit, then it's just straightforwardly incompatible with theism, right? God.
Yeah.
Never, yeah.
Yeah.
Does
yeah.
that
I
make
agree.
sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Right. Let's continue.
Or bad states of affairs. Like you can't go beyond that. You can't appeal to deontology, because deontology is a subset of that, right? So I don't think he actually understands like what I mean when I talk about axiology versus or axiology as a sort of the umbrella term to encompass the moral domain, right? So this is the first problem, which is he gets category errors wrong in understanding like what I actually said, what my point was trying to be. So that's the first problem I just want to point out.
Yeah, I don't think I missed the point there.
Yeah, but anyways, I'll continue on. Yes, God can't do anything wrong, which means God can only do good actions. Okay, yeah, that's I think that's pretty standard like understanding, right? And I think my characterization of the problem was just asking the question of why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur. I think that does encompass all of evil. That encompasses again the moral domain, the aesthetic domain, and the elitic domain. So yeah, it does actually, I think, by my lights, it does sort of get down to the very core of the question, right? And I think if the theist can't answer that, if the theist can answer the question of why God allows bad states of affairs to occur, and if they have a theodicy for that, then that's it. The problem of evil is finished. So any talk about deontology or virtue ethics or consequentialism or literally anything else is irrelevant because we've already answered the fundamental question, right?
Do you have any thoughts on that? Naturalism next.
I mean, I think this is related to what we just talked about, but
Yeah.
I mean, merely explaining why God allows bad states of affairs to occur. I mean, suppose that God has certain like obligations or duties to people. I mean, that seems to be clearly something that could be a subset of the problem of evil, but doesn't have to do with explaining why God allows bad states of affairs to occur. Like, I mean, suppose God has a duty to like reward the faithful or something for their suffering. I mean, that doesn't necessarily like That's not necessarily an explanation of why bad states of affairs occur. It's just an explanation of a duty that God has in answering whether he fulfills the duty. So, I mean, I have no idea if that's, I mean, that's just a duty I made up that God might have. But
Right.
it seems like whether or not that's a full answer to the problem of evil depends on what you think what your normative ethical framework is for God. And I think that this would work if you're a consequentialist, but I'm not sure it would work if you're a virtue ethicist or a deontologist.
Right.
I mean, I get that he's trying to say that axiology like encompasses everything bottoms out in axiology, but then if you're going to make that claim, then you have to then use axiology to include all the things that like deontologists and virtue ethicists are going to find salient about moral affairs. You can't just only look at this one dimension. So it seems like the same point as that we were just sort of making.
Exactly, because like if you just look at the total value of the states of affairs involved, that's not going to be enough if there's going to be some intentional component, like whether it would be virtuous or there'd be some other like reason whether like God would be insufficiently motivated by moral concerns or his will is not such that it obeys the moral law or whatever. There can be these other concerns as well. So like just sort of calculating the total value of the states of affairs involved, I don't think that's enough.
And I think that, I mean, the very idea that you can add up a total value of the states of affairs involved itself assumes a certain like framework, normative framework. I mean, it's not clear that you could add up like the total value of various duties or rights that like duties towards people or rights that people have. I'm not sure you can actually add that up if you're thinking about ethics a certain way. I guess another thing I'd want to say now that I think about it is that, I mean, we have to think about what kind of explanation he's suggesting here when we talk about an explanation, excuse me, for why bad states of affairs occur. Sorry about that. A bit of a cold. So, for instance, he says, if you explain why God allows bad states of affairs to occur, that destroys the problem of evil. But we have to ask, like, how plausible is that explanation relative to alternatives? So, I mean, you can easily do that. You could come up with some conjunctive things you add onto theism that clearly like entail the evils that we see. But if that conjunct itself is less plausible than the probability of the evils on naturalism, then obviously that's not going to solve the problem of evil, at least from a probabilistic standpoint. So also in that sense, merely providing an explanation isn't sufficient. You need to actually look at how plausible the explanation is on theism and how plausible and how likely it makes the data when conjoined with theism, and then compare it to alternatives. So your steps aren't finished. So again, I mean, maybe we can charitably assume he thinks he's going to include that when he says that that's part of the explanation you're giving for why God allows bad states of affairs, but it isn't clear from the way he's stating here that he's going to include that. But maybe he goes on to explain that. I don't know because I haven't watched the video.
It's gonna like when we get into ideas of theoretical learning, which he gets into later, he's gonna say some stuff about when we see the evil, we learn certain entailments from theism. We're gonna get into that later.
Right. Yeah.
But like, yeah, let's just continue to see what he has to say first. I'll because I have like a lot written on that in my slides as well.
Okay. Great.
So that's all I have to say on that. But yeah, let's continue.
So if you get one person to say that this is
Deontology is a subset of axiology, so
there's all considered rather than just saying, oh, it's bad, it's bad. Then I think you avoid a lot of issues of what we're on about. I mean, like, we allow that. We basically decide that completely just, no, this is wrong, right?
yeah, it's bad. It's bad. Yeah, that's the point. It's because
I
deontology.
don't know, like saying that wrong is equivalent to bad. I don't know, like I feel like wrong is like a property of actions or like maxims which move a will, whereas like badness is just going to be like a property of states of affairs. So I don't know, it doesn't seem right to me.
Well, again, deontology is a subset. So, anyways, I'm not going to say much on this particular objection because I don't think it works. But anyways,
moral sounds good. And like when one thing like that, then there's no other case there. More like God's all bad actions, and with the more you best actions, right? With the more you right, are creating perfect right. There's nothing that God does. It's really more.
but the answer is why is God allow acts to occur? Why are there bad properties? Why is God allow bad properties?
No, that's true. The theist sorry, I don't think like white concept anything with that. No, not true at all. So yeah, like the idea is yes, the theist can have an explanation for why God allowed bad things. There's like some stories and stuff that makes that theism consistent with that's fine. But
yeah, this is like this is me making basically the same point you made earlier, where I say there's some story you can tell that makes it the case that like theism is consistent, but you can still get a probability cost there. So, and I think this is where he responds to it actually. So let's see.
Okay, great. Let's hear what he says.
but the idea is theism a better explanation for the evil? Is it more predictive of the evil and naturalism?
All right, so I think this is a fair objection, so to speak. And I think what's important to understand here is that when we're talking about making theism as a better explanation of the data of evil, right? I think that we need to understand like what's called value mapping, right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that is there a theodical connection between God and a bad state of affairs, right? So is there a sort of theodicy you can provide that accounts for that? And I think if you can provide a theodicy, if there's a theodical connection there to that, then yeah, I think theism does expect the data of evil, right? At least in the sense that, as long as, of course, there are going to be constraints there, right? Obviously, we don't want to say that like God could just allow any type of evil, right? I wouldn't go that far, but I think if we do have a theodical connection between God and a state of affairs, then yeah, God, that's the explanation for why God allows it. Now, what about the indifference hypothesis? How does that fare with the indifference hypothesis? Well, the problem is the indifference hypothesis doesn't actually say anything about value. So the best that indifference can do, right, is that you can just say that, well, it's just more epistemically friendly on the indifference hypothesis that you would expect evil, right? And I think this is the way that Paul Draper does it, right? And I think, honestly, if you're going to make an argument from evil, that's where you want to go. But the problem is that as soon as the theist makes a theodical connection there, then it's actually going to favor theism, right? And of course, this is where Trent Dougherty's argument from, I think it was the Saint making theodicy. He makes this argument from animal suffering that basically, like, in order to have like certain virtues, you're going to need like this fine tuning of virtues, right? And I mentioned this later in the video, but basically, like, given this fine tuning of virtues, that would actually be evidence for theism, whereas you can't use that same evidence to support naturalism, right? So that's what I would appeal to in terms of arguing of why theism actually does make positive predictions about evil, right? Or at least make successful predictions about evil. If you want to see more on that specific argument, I did it. If you watch my long video about evil, which is the explanatory flexibility of theism, I sort of laid this out near the end. And of course, my next long video on this channel is going to be going over that as well, more in detail in terms of like the cumulative case for theism that I'm working on. But that's sort of what I would appeal to. So I do think that evil, in that sort of, when you frame it that sort of way, this fine-tuned virtues way, I think evil is evidence for theism, but only in that sort of context, right? And that's all you really need. Whereas, again, in a difference hypothesis, you're not going to make that same sort of positive predictions. The best you can do is say that, well, it's just more epistemically likely on naturalism, right? But again, I would dispute that. So, anyways, I'm going to continue on the video and see what else.
Okay, so I'm just going to let you take this one because I don't really have anything written on my slides until he starts talking about theoretical learning. But I'll let you take this one for now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what he means by no positive prediction, actually. I mean, the way that Paul Draper frames it in his argument is that you make inferences based on the background knowledge in conjunction with your hypothesis about the data. So, for instance, this is just one example. You take naturalism and you can join it with some evolutionary hypothesis, and you take theism and can join it with some evolutionary hypothesis. Let's say that, it seems like all our functions sort of bottom down in biological mechanisms. And then you infer inductively based on that background knowledge that, well, if these functions generally bottom down in biological mechanisms, then pain being just another function, basically of organisms, that will also bottom down in biological mechanisms. And then the difference is that on naturalism, you can make that inference. On theism, that inference is undercut by the fact that we have a reason to think that God might treat pain and pleasure differently than other biological systems in virtue of its moral properties or its moral salience. So the general idea is that there are certain inferences you can make based on the background knowledge that are undercut by the hypothesis of theism, but are not undercut when you are conjoining them with naturalism. I don't know how that plays into what he's saying about positive predictions. But I mean, he says something interesting. He says that, actually, before I get onto that, I should just say that I do think purely from the content of hypotheses, you can get something of a positive prediction out, which is just that, hey, on naturalism, reality is fundamentally indifferent. So in general, we should expect that reality will not show care or regard for conscious creatures. Well, on theism, reality is fundamentally different, and that God actually cares about conscious creatures. So we should expect that there's some sort of distribution or weight towards creatures being treated a certain way or having lives in a certain way. I don't know what he means by positive prediction, but then he sort of says that, well, then when you slap on top a theodicy to theism, then that is better than naturalism, because naturalism wasn't really making any positive prediction, but then we can sort of conjoin theism with something that lets it make the prediction. I mean, sure, you can do that, but I think the key question is, it's just not a matter of coming up with a theodicy, because I can come up with any theodicy I want that's super lame that will entail the data, but it could be a horrible theodicy. Right? So the question is, how plausible is the theodicy? How plausible is the theodicy on theism itself? And then how well does it actually explain the data in question? If it doesn't meet those criteria, then it's not a good theodicy. And so it's not a matter of just, I mean, he makes it seem so simple as if it's just create a theodicy and then you beat naturalism. Well, no, you have to evaluate the plausibility of that theodicy. I'm sure he would agree with that. So, I mean, in all this wasn't really a response so much as just an assertion that, hey, I have this theodicy that works, and when you can join it with theism, it actually beats naturalism. Also, I should note that even if, let's say, his theodicy does actually generate better predictions than the bare naturalistic hypothesis, that doesn't show that theism is better than naturalism, because we could, of course, generate auxiliary hypotheses that you could add to naturalism. You create like naturalistic theodicies that are intended to boost the predictive fit of naturalism with the data of suffering. And so we could play the same game in the other direction. So even if it were the case that he's right, that you can create theodicies that are effective as responses to theism, as auxiliary additions to theism and predicting the data, you could do the same thing for naturalism. So we have to compare the two models when they've been elaborated with their additions, not just only add auxiliary hypotheses to one model to try and get it to fit the data in response or relative to another model. So I guess that's all I'd want to say about that.
Right. Yeah, I take your point about naturalism making predictions with respect to pain and pleasure's connection to reproductive success when you can join it with specific background information about evolution. I made this exact point in my response to Tim Howard, which was like a couple months ago, I think now. Yeah, and also another point to make is that if you just sort of conjoin these auxiliary hypotheses to theism, it seems like you're just going to be like lowering the prior of theism unless you give a reason to think that such hypotheses are entailed in the hypothesis, or you have reason to expect it antecedently prior to expecting the data, or prior to counting the data. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of what I was trying to say about how likely I didn't say this explicitly, so I thank you for saying it more clearly. When you talk about the probability of the theodicy on theism, we need to ask, like, when you can join this to theism, how well does theism actually fit with this theodicy? Because if you're just slapping it on as an extra thing that isn't entailed by or made likely, or isn't likely to be isn't likely to happen on theism, then you're going to reduce the prior probability of theism. So I think Kyle has a response that he wants to make to this that we're going to hear later on, but we'll see what he says about it.
And I have a response to his response, but we'll get to that. Yeah.
To say on this.
And that's going to be the easiest thing. You're going to say that theism doesn't fit. Sure, you can do this before that. Oh, makes a position basically explain Axiology in like a hot way or bad way. But the idea is, if like.
So this idea of, okay, so I get this a lot from atheists, but basically the idea is like, well, if we present a theodicy, isn't that just an auxiliary hypothesis? No, because what we're doing is we're updating the prior. So what we're doing is we are taking evil and suffering as the contextual evidence, right? And then from that, then we can think, and we can do what's called theoretical learning, or learning from hypotheticals. Like, let's just say, for example, that you make one round of predictions. Like the first round of predictions, like, okay, theism entails only good state of affairs. We only see bad state of affairs, therefore theism is false. Okay, that's the first round of predictions. Now what the theists can do is they can step back and say, I wasn't expecting that. How about I change my theoretical content a little bit without adding stuff in, and then see if I get a different result, right? And I think once we do that, this is called the learning from experience, or updating the priors. Then we can sort of make what's called the theodicy, right? From that, right? And I'm not going to do the formal math on this here. I'm going to do that later in my later videos. But there's a way you can do this without entailing that theism is ad hoc, right? So this whole idea that like a theodicy is just an auxiliary hypothesis is just completely wrong. Now, granted, I do think that there are certain theodicies that are ad hoc, right? One example is the fault theodicy, or certain free will theodicies. I'm like, okay, those probably don't work. Or at least if they do work, they only work like in a limited sort of way, or they only address like certain amounts of evil, not all of them, right? But I think the theodicy that I'm working with right now, I don't think has that problem. So obviously, I'm going to hold different views on that, but anyways, I've been rambling too long for now, so I'm going to continue on with the video.
Definition. By the definition is going to have like.
Okay, so I think now might be the appropriate time for me to open up my stuff on, or hit my response to him. So,
Okay, great. Let's do that.
I have this this layout here, so I started out with the argument from. I just want to show this just because I didn't show this earlier, but I started out with the argument from imperfection. The next point is going to be updating the priors of theism. So let's get to that. So here's what I have: updating the priors of theism. So usually. And this is where I kind of get, I probably would have wrote it differently if I did it now, because this was prior to me reading that formal learning SCP page, but no worries, I can correct myself here. So, but usually when we update our priors, we incorporate what we have learned from the data to get a posterior from our prior. So for example, if you initially have a 10% prior that it will rain where you are, probability of rain is 0.1, but then you look outside and see dark clouds. And with this data, you update your belief that it will rain to say 60%. So the probability of rain, given that you have dark clouds, is 0.6. And this posterior will be your updated prior when you account for new data. Like say, next thing you see is you see the weather network and they predict rain, and then you can update your prior based on that. So that's what I initially understood in terms of like the Bayesian sense. And you get this from many introductory books to inductive logic. There's a chapter on learning from experience. from the Introduction to Probability and Inductive Logic by Ian Hacking, and this is where I sort of got this from. But I think what I missed here is I think he's talking about something more specific. He's talking about something related to formal learning theory. But I'll address that after I read the slide. So Kyle suggests that we can simply update the priors of the theistic hypothesis when considering the data of suffering in a way that somehow both diffuses the evidential argument from evil entirely and does not lower the prior of the theistic hypothesis by baking in extra theoretical posits. This is by showing that an entailment of theism would be... Wow, I think I used up too much room here, but whatever. This is by showing that an entailment of theism would be that all evils are defeated and redeemed in the afterlife. On its face, this looks implausible. For one, it hasn't been argued that bare theism entails an afterlife where all evils are defeated, only asserted. It's eminently unclear how an entailment of bare theism could be derived through updating the priors. As described above, the process of updating one's priors does not tell us anything at all about the entailments of a hypothesis or belief. Rather, it only tells us how we should change our credence in a hypothesis/belief given new evidence. If the atheist is right, we should lower our credence in theism when we take into account the data of suffering, which is indeed precisely what the evidential problem of evil is trying to show. And for two, if this is a move that could be made, then we should both back it up, theists and atheists alike, who are interested in the project of Bayesian or IB arguments for or against their views. For any argument a theist can make, e.g. fine-tuning, the naturalists can simply update their priors so that the fine-tuning data is no longer surprising on naturalism. So those are my two responses. I'll let you tell me your immediate thoughts on that and tell me if you agree, and then I'll look at this XCP page here.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the problems is that I'm not actually entirely sure what Kyle thinks is going on because clearly he has a very specific thing in mind. And I think it's something like this. I think it's something like when we look at the data, we actually refine our hypothesis in light of that data, and we are able to have a redo on our predictions. So let's say we have bare theism, and then we look at the data, and we see that it doesn't fit. And then rather than updating our priors in a traditional sense, as you described it there, we have a redo of the run-through of like predicting the data, but with a new theistic hypothesis that we've gerrymandered in some way. They're still within the content of the hypothesis without adding something new on. I don't actually quite understand how that's meant to work, though. I mean, standardly, in a standard Bayesian understanding, and Paul Draper talks about this in a paper that I can link, I mean, that just wouldn't follow. Like, if you redo your round of predictions with a new hypothesis that's more specific, all right, so you have some broad hypothesis A, and then you have two more specific versions of that hypothesis B and C. And let's say you start by running the broad hypothesis and you find that it doesn't fit the data. But then you find that one version of the hypothesis, one more specific version of the hypothesis can predict the data. And then you redo the predictions using that more specific version of the hypothesis. I mean, on the standard Bayesian understanding, that would show that overall, your broad hypothesis is worse off, especially if there's another broad hypothesis that in general predicts it well. That's like the normal understanding. We could go through formally how that works. So I think he has something very specific in mind, but I'm not sure what it is because he doesn't actually elaborate it. My immediate problem with it is sort of what you say is your second point, which is suppose it is possible for us to, in light of data, refine our hypotheses in such a way that we can now predict that data, but we don't alter the prior probability of the hypothesis that we had initially at all. Well, if that's the case, then like you say, you can do that for any Bayesian argument and for any hypothesis. Like when you confront the atheist with anything they're meant not to be able to predict, like fine-tuning or consciousness or beauty, or I don't know, moral knowledge, any of these facts that you think that atheists aren't allowed to predict. I mean, there are many versions of naturalism that we could we could sort of take the concept of naturalism and wrestle around with it until it was sort of a certain axiological consciousness-based naturalism that fit that data perfectly. But I don't think theists would be very happy with us doing that. And I actually don't think that would be a valid move. But if you really could do that, then it would seem like it would sort of destroy all Bayesian arguments for and against theism or naturalism. I actually got into a little argument about this with, I think it was Kyle on Twitter when he was making this point, and he didn't really have anything to say about it. So I still don't quite understand what he thinks, but maybe you've learned a little bit about what he's referencing here. But I think if he wants to continue to push this point, he needs to lay it out more clearly because I don't actually know what he's referring to. It certainly doesn't fit the standard Bayesian understanding of how hypothesis testing works.
Right, yeah, that's what got me lost to it first, because he was talking about this idea of like updating your priors and learning from experience. But what that means in Bayesianism has nothing to do with like figuring out like what's entailed from like the content of a hypothesis or something. Like that's, I at first like I was completely lost on what he was talking about, but I think I have a better idea here now. So let's scroll down here. I think, hold on. I think this is where like it talks about sub-hypotheses. So I think the basic idea of what he's talking about is this. So let's read this. Characterization theorems tell us how the structure of reliable methods is attuned to structure hypotheses under investigation. For example, the theorem mentioned establishes a connection between falsifiability and testability, but one is more attenuated than naive Popperian envisions. It is not necessary that the hypothesis under test be directly falsifiable. Rather, there must be ways of strengthening each hypothesis that yield a countable number of refutable sub-hypotheses. We can think of these refutable sub-hypotheses in different ways in which the main hypothesis might be true. For example, one way in which all but finally many swans are white is true is if there are 10 black swans. Another is if there are 100 black swans. Strengthening the original hypothesis so that they become empirically refutable matches is the spirit of Lakatos's methodology, in which a general scientific paradigm is articulated with auxiliary hypothesis to define testable, i.e. falsifiable claims. So I think the idea that he might be getting at is that we're partitioning the outcome space for theism because there's these refutable sub-hypotheses of theism. And one of the sub-hypotheses would be ones which don't include an afterlife, or ones where evil is not defeated. And the observations we see of like evil entail that those refutable sub-hypotheses are false. So what we're doing is we're just learning from experience by taking these refutable sub-hypotheses out and updating theism. I think that's what he's getting at, and it's something similar to what's being said here.
Right.
I think that's what he's trying to say. But I mean, there's a few problems with this. So for one, if we scroll up here, it talks like about how we often use it, like for example in conservation laws and particle physics. So what we do is so basically this formal learning theory is like a specific thing in like normative epistemology where we apply a means and analysis to certain evidence or observations we have. So and here's where it describes it. Like Schultz describes the inductive method that accomplishes this goal. Formally, the method describes as follows. Suppose we have an observed set of reactions among elementary particles. Conjecture a set of laws that permit the observed reactions and rules out as many unobserved reactions as possible. So notice it says rules out as many unobserved reactions as possible. So what you might get is that when you observe when you have a hypothesis and you observe some unobservables, some observed reactions. What you'll have to do is you have to posit theoretical unobservables in order to like account for some phenomena that would ruin the hypothesis, or that would refute the hypothesis if you don't posit some theoretical unobservable. Like one standard example is perhaps dark matter in general relativity, or something like that. And so what you'd be doing is you'd be partitioning the hypotheses, and you'd be adding certain theoretical unobservables, and in order to but one problem with this is that it seems like the reason we'd be doing this is so that we'd be calculating theoretical virtues as a whole. So when we have a hypothesis or certain hypotheses in conservation laws and particle physics, it seems like the reason we have these hypotheses, and the reason why we wouldn't take them to be refuted by new data of observables, and the reason why we'd be motivated to posit these unobservables, because that's the only way to sort of explain the data from our experience. That's the only way to account for these new observations. It seems the reason we're doing this is because we already have this hypothesis, and it already has all these novel predictions, and there's so much scientific utility we get from it. But I don't think that's going to be the case for theism, for example, because I don't think theism, for example, is going to have a lot of explanatory utility in terms of especially not in terms of novel predictions. And I'm not intending to mean novel predictions in a narrow sense, where novel predictions is only observation. It doesn't include old evidence. You can have a hypothesis which explains old evidence, and that could still be a novel prediction as long as in the process of constructing the hypothesis, you're not constructing a hypothesis in such a way that it's meant to account for this old evidence. But if it's like a feature that's unrelated to why the hypothesis is constructed that accounts for this old evidence, then that's going to still be a novel prediction as long as you're not constructing a hypothesis with the, to explain the data involved. It could still be that old evidence is a novel prediction. But the thing is, like, the reason why we're doing this is that we don't want to like compromise in other theoretical virtues. We have like this theory, and like what we'd be doing is if we give up on the theory, we'd be giving up a theory that has all these like this useful stuff that like it's part of like this progressive, what Emil Lakatos would call a progressive research program. It's successfully generated all these predictions, and it's successfully, it just works, right? And so like, all things considered, it would be better for us to posit these theoretical unobservables. Whereas like with theism, it just seems like the move that's being made is that you already have theism as a commitment, and you're just sort of like, you're sort of like stipulating it, and the only reason you're doing it is just to save theism from, like from evidence, from the argument from evil. It doesn't seem like there's some like independent like motivation in terms of like preserving scientific utility here. That's one issue I have with it. And another issue is that it seems like, I could be completely wrong here, but it seems like this idea of formal learning theory, it requires the idea of there being, like you have the hypothesis, in order to like learn from a hypothesis, it has to be refutable and verifiable. And there's like a big chunk of this article which talks about it, like verifiable and refutable hypotheses. And what a verifiable hypothesis is in the technical sense of a learning theory is that basically there's a finite set of observations which entail the hypothesis. That's what it means for it to be verifiable. So it gives the example of some ravens are not black. So like if some ravens are not black, all that will require is that we observe that some ravens are not black. So some finite set of observations could entail the hypothesis. And for it to be refutable is like the negation of that. So some finite set of observations entail that the hypothesis is false. So that's refutability and verifiability. But it seems like the bare theistic hypothesis is neither refutable nor verifiable in this sense. Like what finite set of observations entail the theistic hypothesis, and what finite set of observations entail the negation of the theistic hypothesis. Plausibly, if there is a finite set of observations which entail that the theistic hypothesis is false, it's going to be something related to horrific evils. But it seems like Kyle's appeal to things like the defeat condition would sort of like nullify that completely. So it doesn't seem like any finite set of observations could refute the theistic hypothesis or verify the theistic hypothesis. In which case, I don't really understand how this idea of formal learning theory can apply to learning from the theistic hypothesis at all. Like, I don't understand how it would work. But do you have anything further to say there?
Yeah, I want to add to the first half of what you said about how one of the reasons that we're sort of justified in putting in these theoretical unobservables, or like adding in these sort of partitioning the outcome space such that we select some like more specific hypothesis, that we're justified in doing that because these theories are really, really useful, that you're in their explanatory keep by making like novel predictions and by fitting into the general like research program that's been successful in science. That's sort of what you said about when we can do this. It also seems like a really important point there is also when we lack a good alternative, an alternative is just as good, right? It seems like the existence of alternatives is important here. Like say we had some alternative to our current like standard understanding of particle physics and relativity such that we didn't need to like posit. I mean, I don't even know if this is correct. So, if I'm totally wrong about this, some physicists can refute me. But say we didn't need to like posit dark matter as like some unobservable thing to explain some part of the theory. We had some alternative that did just as well as our general standard understanding of particle physics and of relativity, but didn't need to add in this unobservable, like extra special category of things. Well, then it seems like in that case, we should reject the standard model and adopt that new model. Similarly, like a case of this from example of just the history of science would be like geocentrism and heliocentrism. I don't know if you've heard of epicycles, but one way to sort of save the geocentric model in light of certain observations is to posit these epicycles. I won't get into them, but they're basically like an extra complicated path that certain, I think it's like moons or planets take. and it's a way to sort of save certain observations that are more compatible with heliocentrism. Now, if geocentrism was the only hypothesis on the table, and it had earned its explanatory keep, it's part of science and made good predictions, then maybe we can posit these epicycles. And it makes sense to select this sort of more specific version of the geocentric hypothesis in order to save the theory. But as soon as we have an alternative that doesn't require that we adopt this sort of sub-hypothesis, such as heliocentrism, and equally explains the data, it seems like we're justified in jumping on board with that hypothesis. So I'm still actually not quite seeing how this thing about learning theory justifies us in partitioning the outcome space and just subsetting, like, and just switching over to the version of the theistic hypothesis that fits with the data better, without considering the prior or the alternatives. It seems like the alternatives are key in learning whether we should do this or whether we should switch over to the alternative. So that's just one thought I had on the first part of what you said.
Right, I think that's exactly right. Like, I think what you want to consider when you do this sort of thing, when you sort of consider whether you should posit these theoretical and observables, is what you consider what are the costs of the theoretical virtues as a whole. And like, for me, it's not obvious in the slightest. In fact, it seems false that there's not going to be like a cost in terms of theoretical virtues if you sort of just just add on this idea that theism entails an afterlife when you observe that. It doesn't seem like it seems like that's just going to be a cost in terms of theoretical virtues. And I'm going to get into this more later, but I don't think we're going to get into in this stream because that's going to be a bit later. But it seems like when you start doing that, I think you end up getting that theism doesn't really have any empirical content at all. So I just think it's just a cost on theoretical virtues, all things considered, right? Whereas when we posit theoretical and observables in the example the article gives for conservation laws and particle physics, it's going to be a benefit, all things considered, for theoretical virtues, because we have really good reasons to prefer the hypothesis independently in virtue of scientific utility and novel predictions and whatnot. So that's definitely like one response, and why I'm sort of like not on board with what Kyle's saying here, and it doesn't seem plausible to me. And
do you actually understand when Kyle thinks it's okay to do this partitioning and like select a more specific hypothesis, like the conditions under which you should do that rather than adopting an alternative? Because I feel like I don't have a good grasp on when he thinks we should be allowed to do that.
That's pretty unclear to me too. Like,
okay.
Yeah, I think it's not just you. Like, I think it's kind of mysterious to me too. But I don't think it's Kyle that's like I don't think Kyle is like the bearer of this sort of argument or this information. I think he's getting all this stuff from Trent Doherty. Yeah, and I think later on he actually plays a clip from Trent Doherty and who talks about formal learning theory later. But that's going to be like later, I think.
Gotcha.
So I think that's where he gets this, and maybe there's something we're missing here, but like it doesn't seem to me that that's the case. It doesn't seem to me that there's much hope here in terms of like appealing to formal learning theory. But he does say that he's going to create like a video on this, so maybe that'll sort of illuminate this more for us.
Yeah, that would help. Or he could send, if he wants to link a certain passage in like Doherty or someone else that could explain it more, that would also be helpful, because at the moment it seems under elaborated and just not motivated. So
right, I completely agree. Yeah, and it's also just unclear to me how this formal learning theory, how we can like learn from the theistic hypothesis, draw entailments from the theistic hypothesis, if it's not the case that the bare theistic hypothesis is not refutable or verifiable at all. Like, maybe he'll dispute that. Maybe he'll say that actually it is refutable and verifiable, but doesn't seem plausible to me. Like, especially if you start like you sort of make it so that like no observation in terms of evil is going to be like count against the hypothesis. So it certainly doesn't seem like anything's going to any set of observations, any finite set of observations, at least, is going to entail the falsity of the theistic hypothesis. So in that sense, it's in the sense of what he says here, this formal or this sort of specific definition of refutability when it comes to formal learning. It doesn't seem like the hypothesis is going to be refutable, and it doesn't seem like the hypothesis is going to be verifiable either. Because if there's some, I don't know what it would mean for some finite set of observations to entail the theistic hypothesis. Could you think of anything? Any finite set of observations which entail the theistic hypothesis? Like actually like entail it. Like not just like raise the probability of theism.
I mean, no, I mean, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know that, I mean, it's interesting because I know that Doherty thinks that we're like in a certain zone of possible worlds that fits well with theism, where if you had less or more of like, I think it's something to do with soul making and like saint making or something, and that we're right in the correct spot. So it seems like Doherty agrees that, you know, things could be such that there are observations that disconfirm theism, but only probabilistically, not like via entailment. But if Doherty agrees with that, then I'm having trouble understanding what this adds to just saying, look, I have a theodicy that predicts the data well. I don't know what the stuff about formal learning theory actually adds to what Kyle's trying to do if he's just trying to run Doherty's theodicy. Yeah. But yeah, I can't think of any observation. I've not read Doherty's book.
Oh, okay. I have read some. I don't think I read the whole thing, but I have read some of it, and I don't think I've seen anything. I could be like completely mistaken here, so don't take my word for like don't put too much salt on it. But I could be totally mistaken. But I don't think he mentions anything about formal learning theory in his book.
Huh. Interesting.
So, yeah, but I think that's what he has to be talking about, because I remember like reading this and I think, okay, maybe this is what he's talking about. So I don't know. But like again, the main issue I think is going to be like with the theistic hypothesis. If it's not refutable or verifiable, then I don't see how you can apply formal learning theory to it at all. Like there may be some specific, more specific theisms which posit or more specific desires of God, which might be refutable by some set of observations. But like bare theism, it doesn't seem like is going to be the case that it's refutable by some set of observations, especially if we take it if we take Kyle's view, where evil doesn't even like probabilistically count against theism. It doesn't seem like any observation you could possibly have could entail the falsity of theism in that case.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, if you're an atheist, you might think that there are certain observations that entail the falsity of theism, like specifically certain instances of horrendous evil. But obviously, Kyle doesn't agree with that. So.
Right. Yeah. Maybe Kyle will be watching this and shaking his head because we're totally missing the point here. But I don't know. Like,
I mean, I think it's on him to elaborate because, like, I think I'm familiar enough with Bayesian arguments from evil to follow the usual points about them, and like this one, I actually don't follow much of it. So I think Kyle needs to elaborate. Maybe if he agrees to like doing a joint stream with us, he can talk about it more.
No, yeah, that would definitely be good. That would be useful to hash out. Do you agree that like what this says here is probably the closest to what Kyle has in mind?
That seems like a plausible interpretation if that's what he's referencing. I mean, I think the summary you gave earlier seems like the best reconstruction of what he's trying to say. So.
Right. Yeah, but I still don't think it works for the reasons I laid out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to continue, or are you running out of time actually?
Let's watch like one more section, and then I'll leave after that, like 9:30, and then we'll do the next part. After.
All right. When would you say is a good time to do the next part? Like tomorrow or whatever?
Yeah, probably tomorrow.
All right, fair enough. I'll just play this next part then.
Yeah, we'll do one more.
Right, simpler, whether it explains the facts in a non-contact way, right? You see the facts in a virtue theory, right? It's testable, it's informative, it doesn't undermine divine psychology such that, all states of affairs are going to be consistent with it, right?
Oh, actually, I actually have like another. You want me to just go through this? Actually, I actually have another slide on updating the priors of theism. So do you want me to actually go through this?
Yeah, let's do that as the last thing we do for this stream.
Right. So Kyle has said that there's a process of theoretical learning, and this is when we consider the data of suffering. We find that theism entails this or that story. Now, there are two ways of interpreting what Kyle could be saying. One way of interpreting what Kyle could be saying is that the content of the theistic hypothesis alone, like without building in extra content and without considering the data, entails that God has morally sufficient reason to permit the frequency and distribution of suffering we observe, namely that he intends to commit evil so that it is defeated in the afterlife, right? And we're going to be getting like more in depth into that later when he talks about the defeat condition. And the second is that the theistic hypothesis, this is the second interpretation of what he can be saying, is that the theistic hypothesis, in conjunction with the data, so we're not like talking about the theistic hypothesis alone, rather we're conjoining the theistic hypothesis with the data of evil, of suffering, of the distribution and frequency of evil, horrific suffering we observe. So we can call that T and D, theism and the data, jointly entails a third proposition M. God has morally sufficient reasons for all the evil that are contained in the data. So like theism plus the data jointly entails this proposition about God having morally sufficient reason, which is specifically that the evil is defeated in the afterlife, such that the creature, the creature's life on the whole is better, all things considered. So, and I think there are problems with both interpretations. So regarding one, I agree that if the point goes through that if the bare content of a theistic hypothesis, without considering the data and without building in extra content, entails that God is a morally sufficient reason. I agree if that's true. Then the evidential problem of evil is just dead. Like, it's not a good argument at all. But if we're talking about what's entailed in the theistic hypothesis alone, then the claim that we are learning and updating is mysterious. Like, what would that even mean? Like, if we're looking at the content of the theory, we're not updating our priors or
Right.
learning from the data. We're just looking at the content of the theory. And more crucially, if he claims that there is an entailment, he needs to show the derivation from only those propositions or properties or whatever, which constitute the bare theistic hypothesis, to the proposition that there are outweighing reasons to permit all the evil we see. But for deductive entailment, you aren't going to get any substance in if you don't put substance in, which is just the nature of deduction. So the content of a deductive argument's conclusion will just represent the content already contained in the premises. So it's implausible in the extreme that without building in extra content and lowering the prior theism, we are going to be able to get an entailment to a specific proposition about God's having morally justifying reasons that are tied to those prima facie evil states of affairs in the actual world, which includes horrendous and moral and natural evils, and evolutionary facts about pain and pleasure, flourishing and languishing, predation and parasitism, etc. So that just seems implausible. Like, you understand my point here, right? Like,
Well, this is why it's so confusing what he means by learning and updating, because, like you said, if we're just talking about bare theism and we're not like tacking on anything extra, we're just sticking with bare theism, then does he think that we're finding some entailment from bare theism without without bringing into account any new auxiliary hypothesis that we're like generating via the data? I mean, if he thinks we're doing that, then I have no idea how he thinks we're going to even get to the data whatsoever. So I think he must be saying that somehow we're using the data in order to like add to bare theism somehow, but I don't know how we can do that and stay within the confines of like the deductive entailments of bare theism.
right.
Which I guess, and so this gets to point two, which is like, let's say he's saying that we're conjoining theism with the data, and we're using that to update the theistic hypothesis. I mean, you can read point two.
Okay, so regarding two, plausibly it is true that theism and the data entails M, which is that God has morally sufficient reasons to permit all the evil that is contained in the data. But this says nothing about the evidential problem of evil. What we are interested in when forming an evidential problem of evil is what we expect to be the case antecedently on a theistic hypothesis. That theism, in conjunction with the data of evil in the actual world, entails that God has morally sufficient reasons to permit the evil, given that it will be defeated in the afterlife, is entirely compatible with the data of evil in the actual world being antecedently very unlikely on theism. To refute the evidential problem of evil, what would need to be shown is that we have antecedent reason to expect that God would have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils in the actual world, but then we'd just be going back to point one, and that, with bare content of the theistic hypothesis, we can get some entailment, right? So
yeah, exactly the point there. And for people who don't know what like antecedent probability means, it means we're asking for the probability of a particular piece of data on a hypothesis independent of the truth of that of that data, like independent of the fact that of all the observations that permit us to know that data is true, what we expect on theism prior to observing the data of evil. So you can imagine that like we came down on an alien spacecraft and we're looking down at Earth and we don't know anything about the conditions on Earth, and we're just using the hypothesis of theism to predict what the conditions on Earth will be like without actually knowing what the suffering is going to be like on Earth. You can't like once you know that the data obtains, you cannot then use that to predict that the data will obtain. That's obviously like an invalid kind of reasoning to do. So you need to ask what you're going to expect on the hypothesis independent of the fact that we know that the data obtains, which is the whole point about antecedent probability that Kyle's trying to get around somehow.
Right. Yeah, so basically those are the only two ways I think his point could be interpreted, and I think both of them, like for point one, like that just makes his claim that we're learning from experience, or we're doing some sort of we're learning from the data. That just makes his claim completely mysterious, right? But then for point two, it just completely fails to address the evidential problem of evil at all. Like it just doesn't do anything to the argument.
Maybe what I want to say is like we look at the data, we learn from the data, and somehow we're updating theism, and then we allow ourselves a do-over where we reevaluate the antecedent probability of theism using the updated version of theism that we updated using the data. But now we're looking again at the antecedent probability after having updated it. But I have no idea how that would work. He doesn't really elaborate on how it would work.
Yeah,
so
that doesn't seem to be.
And it also seems a little bit like incoherent, because we're basically what that would be saying is like, let's take the antecedent probability of theism, having already taken into account the data, but pretending that we didn't take it into account. You know what I mean? Which isn't really doing antecedent probability anymore. So it's quite confusing.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, presumably, I mean, like we're not like when we're looking at the content of the theistic hypothesis alone, we're not considering the data. So the idea that like we can like take the data and then we're just looking at the bare content of the theistic hypothesis without the data again, it's like what are you talking about? Like what is that? Maybe I'm just confused. But yeah, maybe this just goes into his point about formal learning theory. I'm not sure, dude. I don't know. I don't really have much to add, but like the most plausible interpretations I can get from like what Kyle's saying is these two, and I think both of them don't work.
Yeah, I totally agree with the analysis you write on the slides there. Let's pause, but well, at least I'm gonna hop off the stream for now, but I'll join tomorrow whenever we do this next to continue through the video.
Right. Hopefully we'll finish it next time.
Yeah, hopefully. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks for hopping